All right. Welcome everybody to the Health Transformation webinar. This is your host, Regan Archibald, and just really excited to be with you guys today. And we got a really cool guest. As usual, we got Regan Archibald here, founder of East West Health, all around decent guy. How's it going, Regan?
Good. I appreciate being all around and decent. That's really
it's actually pretty incredible.
Thank you.
And hopefully you guys have been really enjoying the webinar series. And along with us, we got a guest today, a really cool lady, Mishele Walker. So a little bit about Mishele. She's a licensed professional counselor. She helps people know how to relate in a healthy way with each other, which I think is like paramount. She's been happily married for the last 10 plus years. And that was before she knew the rules of relationships and could keep them together. And so prior to that, she had some challenges. She had a tough time actually seeing a healthy relationship. So she's also worked with, looks like for the last 30 years, a researcher named John Gottman has been studying couples to see if there's patterns in relationships. So he's created a formula that he can predict divorce by 90% accuracy. That's crazy.
That is awesome.
Really cool.
Yeah.
And they're based on whether or not 4 things are present in their communication. So I'm hoping we'll get a little glimpse at what those 4 things. Also found a set of behaviors that all couples who last long-term and still claim to be happy always do. And then his theory has now been translated to include friendships, parent-child relationships, same-sex couples, and couples from every culture. Turns out we all relate in very similar ways. So I'm really excited to welcome Mishele Walker on the show. How's it going, Mishele?
Good, thank you, Kate.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to hear, and I'm like chomping at the bit. What are these 4 main things? But before we dive into that, I think for today's format, we're gonna have kind of Regan's gonna be asking a lot of questions. And then for you on the webinar, type into the chat box if you have any specific questions for Mishele or anyone on the panel. And then I'll be kind of handling that side of it on the back end. So I'll turn it over to you, Regan. Welcome, Mishele.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, really good to have you here, Mishele. So Mishele, how did you get into this field? I mean, you're a licensed therapist and you got such a busy practice that we have a small window that we can communicate through all the time, but how did you get into this?
Well, there was a lot of mental illness in my family growing up. So when I say that I didn't know the rules of relationships, I really hadn't seen a healthy one up close. And I think because of that, I had to work extra hard to understand the world around me and to relate to other people. And so in the process of trying to help myself to become a better person, I had an opportunity. Years ago, I was working for an airline, Continental Airlines. I was a trainer, so I do a lot of training. I'm well versed in that. And when 9/11/2001 happened, I was one of those that got laid off. And at the time, it was President Bush who was our president, and he gave all airline employees an automatic 2 years of unemployment. And the first thing I said to myself was 2 years is a master's degree. So I already had a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I was able to go back to school and get my master's degree during those 2 years. And that's how I ended up becoming a counselor. And it's just been a really great journey. I've learned a lot about myself, and I've been able to teach others a lot of things.
Awesome. And I mean, if you look at everything in your career, as far as relationships go, we all have relationships. Kate and I have relationships. I have an amazing wife. I have a team. I have relationships with my patients. What are some of the fundamental areas that break down in relationships?
Usually it's communication. They have some top 3s that people argue about, and it's parenting, sex, and money. And those
Oh,
are the top three
surprise.
things that break things up.
Okay, so parenting, sex, and money. Those are the top three. And communication breakdown. I think, like, what is kind of the first level that just starts to peel away? Is it where people withhold information? Is it people like create false perceptions about someone's actions? What have you noticed?
Well, it's interesting because I think the major issue is that people don't know that most of our issues are unresolvable. So like Dr. Gottman found that actually 69% of our issues with any given person are not going to be resolvable. What do you think about that number?
Whoa, 69%? You got to be kidding me. Now, when you say unresolvable, my skepticism radar goes off. I'm like, come on, every issue is resolvable, Michelle. So prove it to me, lady.
Well, the thing is that we all have issues with, not issues, but we all have ways that we develop our personality. And it's developed when we're young, and things will happen to us, and we'll say either I'm going to do that when I grow up, or I'm never going to do that when I grow up.
Yeah.
And because there's so many variables in the experience or the things that are meaningful to each person, it really isn't possible to be more compatible than that 31%, which is the difference between 69% and 100.
Right.
So that 31% is about all that we actually are compatible. And the thing is this 69% of issues that are unresolvable doesn't mean that couples can't find compromises along the way. It's just that nobody's going to be completely happy with the end result, but they'll find compromises that work. And what Dr. Gottman found is that couples that last long term really have a specific way of discussing the issues that they can't resolve.
And so what are some ways that couples can actually have a conversation around this? Because that's a pretty big number, and you can only have so many compromises in a relationship before you just go into despair, and you're like, man, what's the point of all this tension and stress, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's what kind of couples will come into my office, and either they haven't talked about their issues or they've argued and fought about them over and over again. And I think sometimes it's helpful to understand that they're not resolvable immediately, because relationships, especially marriage relationships, are a marathon. They're not a sprint.
Yeah.
And so what Dr. Gottman found is that couples who last long-term know that it's not necessarily the issue that they're discussing that is the problem. It's the meaning of that underneath it. And I'll kind of give you an example if you'd like. Like I had a couple in my office. They were fighting about money. So he had a tendency to take all their extra money and do fun things. He loved to play all kinds of sports. He loved to do daring things like, paragliding, different stuff like that. She, on the other hand, would, anytime she got a hold of any of their extra money, would put it in an account that didn't have his name on it and just hide it from him. So as you can imagine, they're
Right.
having trouble.
That create a little tension. Yeah.
Yeah. So I took them through the exercise that I learned from Dr. Gottman's work, and it is that they have to talk about the meaning of money, not what the issue is.
Yeah.
So when you ask him, what does money mean to you? Well, he says, money means freedom to me. And I ask him the second question, which is, what is your history with that? Well, his history with freedom comes from when he was 16, he got in a car accident and he almost died. And at that point in time, he said, I am going to live my life to the fullest every day because I don't know when it's going to end, because that was his experience.
Yeah.
And then I asked him the third question, which is, what are all your feelings around it? Well, I feel an intense need to do this, and I feel very frustrated with her that she hides our money from me and doesn't let me do these things that I feel like that my time's going to run out. So that's his perception of it.
Wow.
Now you ask her, what does money mean to you? And for her, money means security. Question
Sure.
number 2 is, what is your history with that? Well, her history is that her parents are both in their 70s, still having to work and having to live off of their children because they never saved anything. And she is determined never to be that way. So for her, she's got to sock away every ounce of the money. And so all of her feelings around that are she's frightened. She wants to have this security. She's afraid that she's going to be like her parents, right?
Yeah.
So that's a very different way to discuss this, because what they're discussing is how each of them sees money and what it means to them. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Gottman found that if couples can discuss in a kind way how the other person perceives the issue as far as meaning, that over time they will gradually drift together. Now, this couple I worked with for almost 2 years before they finally found a compromise where there was some money for him and some for her to feel safe. And that's how long it takes sometimes.
Yeah. Well,
to
2
discuss those things.
Yeah, 2 years is, that goes by pretty darn fast. And to the relationships, putting work into relationships is so important. Well, that's interesting because, you look at my wife and I, and we are like polar opposites. And one of the things that helped bring us together in our communication is there's 2 tests. One of them was called the Kolbe profile. And I don't know if you've studied much on the Kolbe profile. That's Kathy Kolbe, Kolbe. But we learned that we all have everyone has different ways of taking action and modes of operation. And mine is completely opposite of my wife. She needs all the details, the analytics. And I'm just someone who goes on kind of gut instinct, and I just go for things. And then I do my research as I'm already in the middle of it. And so that was one test. The other one's called PRINT. And PRINT actually is, it's an interesting test that shows your subconscious drivers. And so my subconscious drivers are to enjoy life and have fun. That's my primary driver. And the way that I do that, my secondary, the way I show up to the world, is to be self-reliant and responsible. And my wife's is security. So her primary driver is safety and security. So, and then the way she shows up to the world is like hard work and resourcefulness. And so pretty interesting, because that helped us create context around the way I do things and the way she does things. And so have you used those tests at all, Mishele? What do you think about that?
That's interesting. That sounds great. I think I'm more like you. I kind of deal with life in more of the have fun and create things kind of method. And my husband is much more the detailed person, and he's the one who's more conservative. And maybe that's why we work well together.
Yeah, but it used to drive my wife crazy. She thought that I was, maybe not being as respectful, or she was like, you don't take into consideration, like you changed the plan last minute. And when I changed the plans, it was just because that's how I operate. I see what looks the most fun, and then that's where I'm going. The biggest adventure is what I'm always kind of sniffing out. So it sounds like you're kind of the same way. But
I'm the same way.
Yeah, it's so fun. But once we learned, and I would be like, why? Come with me. Like, join the party is kind of was my mentality. But then once I realized, oh, she needs to be more strategic. She needs things like really ironed out first. And then she wants to have a plan that we execute on, and we stick with the plan. Once I saw what she needs, then I tried to, we have tried to compromise, and it's made our relationship 10 times better, just understanding how we work. So very interesting that he's done this. So we talked about money and putting meaning around money, and sex. So I guess it's the same thing with sex, because that's another breakdown.
Most often couples argue about the frequency of sex. And it's almost always men wanting it more often, and women feeling tired and stressed. An important thing to maybe understand about a sexual relationship with couples is that men will relieve their stress through sex, and women, if they're stressed, lose their sex drive.
Okay.
And so the best way for a man to help a woman feel a little more like she wants to do it is to take over some of those responsibilities that are stressing her out. And even if it's just for a day, it'll give her enough opportunity to relax and feel more willing.
Oh, got it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I guess same thing with the woman. If the female in the relationship just says, "Hey, give me till tomorrow," then the man can just kind of calm down. And
usually, if the female will make appointments with her husband, so that he knows that there are certain times or this week or whatever that we're going to actually spend together, it's just a lot easier on her and on him, because she can prepare herself a little bit more, maybe de-stress a little bit, and he can have something to look forward to. So we usually set appointments.
That's a great idea. So Cade, you need to get your calendar set up and as do I. I think everyone
On it.
on this. That's great. That's brilliant advice. Calendar. It's like no, not twice a day, Kate. That's not what she's saying.
Come on. I feel like it's a dirty trick that our creators did. Like it's like the exact polar opposites. Like men relieve stress that way. Women, it's like no thanks if they're stressed.
There's so many of those, even in communication.
Oh,
because
totally.
women have it. Women, we can talk about our feelings for hours with another woman, and we're just fine with it. But when you're talking with a guy, we really have to give him the Cliff Notes version of things. He doesn't want all the details. And so learning to communicate a little bit differently, and men being a little more patient with women giving them too many details, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So now you asked me about the 4 things that Dr. Gottman predicted divorce with. And I think these are important. Have you got a minute to
Let's do it.
talk about those?
Totally.
Yeah. So the 4 things Dr. Gottman found, if any one of these things are present, your relationship will end 90% of the time. The first one is criticism, and the second one is defensiveness. So they kind of go hand in hand. One person will criticize, the other person will defend.
Right.
So criticism and defensiveness. The single best predictor is contempt. And contempt is where one person thinks that their view of the world is superior to the other. And there's a lot of superiority involved in that. But contempt can be anything. It can be name calling. It can be put downs in public. There's so many things that fall under the category of contempt. But if contempt is present, a single best predictor, the relationship will end or become unhappy.
Yeah.
And then the last one is called stonewalling. And that's the word that he put for people who just brush things under the rug over and over, who really don't ever talk things out or take a moment. The conversations that we talked about in the beginning, he says to have regularly, but you do have to make an appointment to talk about issues that are hard. So when you have the conversation about what does this issue mean to you, couples have to make an appointment for that. They have to be willing to use time out and really just calm their bodies down. And they have to set a time limit on it because it's not resolvable. So you could talk about it till 3 a.m., but you're not going to find a resolution immediately. So he says set a time limit on it too.
Okay. And what kind of time frame?
Well, he says to just ask those 3 questions. The questions are, what does this mean to you?
Yep.
What is your history with it? And what are all the feelings? So those are the 3 questions. And if you ask those of each other, the last thing that you come together and say is there a compromise yet? Is there a small area we can compromise? And so, and I mean, I experienced this in my own marriage because my husband and I, when we first got married, decided to buy a home together. And 2 years later, we finally did it. It was maybe more like a year and a half later because we couldn't agree on what we wanted in a home. And it took a lot of discussion, a lot of compromise. I was tired of taking care of a yard and living in the suburbs. I wanted a little more of, condo city life. And he wanted a home in the suburbs with the lawn and blah, blah, blah.
So
we ended up in Cottonwood Heights for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And we had bought a small house with a tiny yard, which he agreed to take care of. And when we got into the home and he didn't take care of the yard, like he had agreed to, this is the other thing is like, we can't get angry at our spouse. And so I didn't get angry. I just solved the problem. I just hired the neighbor boy to mow the lawn. You know what I mean? It's just those things that you do for the sake of the relationship. There's things that we do.
Oh, that's brilliant. And so that would be, those are the 4 predictors of divorce. And so I'm sure everyone on here is kind of like taking inventory about their own behavior and how they're showing up in a relationship. And so if you start seeing those patterns, let's say someone's stonewalling or they have, contempt, what's a way that is there a way to reverse it? Because I know you said you got to schedule a time to talk about things that are damaging, but if you've already got those 4 things, I mean, should people just cut bait and get out of it, or what's your opinion there?
Well, thank you. Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's important because there are antidotes. He calls them antidotes to those 4 things. Instead of criticizing, what we do is express what we are feeling without using the word you in the sentence. So instead of saying to my husband, you do this and you do that, what I would say is, I feel frustrated when I heard this said or when I saw this happen. It's best to describe the issue as if it's not in somebody's body. It's not a fault in you or a fault in me. It's just this issue out here between us. And you describe it neutrally. And the best way to do that is to avoid any kind of blame.
Yeah.
And then defensiveness, he says the best way to break that criticize, defend cycle, if you're on the other end of being criticized and you feel a temptation to defend, he says that there's usually a small amount of truth in what the other person is saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so what he suggests is that you just own a tiny part of it. So if someone says to you, you always do this, you can think about it and say, yeah, sometimes I do. And sometimes just owning a small part of what the other person is saying will stop that criticize, defend cycle.
Okay. So it kind of almost validates what they're saying. And then by validating it, it diffuses the energy behind it.
That's it exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then with contempt, it's just really important to make sure that we see our partner as an equal, that we don't feel like our view of the world is superior, because truthfully, there's a lot of right and wrong when it comes on a community level. Like we have to not steal from each other or kill each other in order to survive.
Sure.
And those rules definitely apply. But when it comes to personally relating with someone else, there really isn't any right or wrong. There's just different ways of seeing the world. And it's really important to understand that my partner is not inferior or superior to me, just different.
Got it. That sounds awfully zen, Mishele.
It's hard to do, is to take judgment out of that.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah.
And then, of course, with stonewalling, what stonewalling is this comes from an interesting study. So back in the 50s, before we had ethics, they had taken a group of people, several groups of people, but over time, and they would put them facing a screen, like a movie screen. And they would sneak up behind them and shoot a gun off behind them. Now, they were monitoring their heart rates and things like that at the same time. And what they were trying to see was how people reacted to being startled in that way. And so,
oh, interesting.
Again, this was before ethics. But what they found is that men's heart rates went up really fast and came down slow. A woman's heart rate, on the other hand, most often would go up slow and come down fast. And so when you're talking about issues, even if it's just an issue, you might be talking about your mother-in-law, and your heart rate can get up to 100 beats per minute pretty fast, and the body doesn't know that you're not in an emergency, so it responds as if you were in an emergency. It will take all the blood and force it into the center of the body, and you can almost feel the blood drain from your head. And because of that, people end up saying things they don't mean and different things like that. So the very best thing with stonewalling is to make efforts to talk your issues out in that way I told you about, talking about meaning, but to remember to use timeout. So once the heartbeat gets up above 100 beats per minute, his suggestion was that couples have a hand signal, like a timeout signal you would use at football or whatever, like just a hand signal. And that means that we have to go apart. And he says it takes at least 20 minutes for the body to calm down. And you do need to be thinking about other than what you're going to be saying next, because then you're not calming down. But you do have to distract yourself. And then he says, try to take the full 20 minutes, because that's how long it takes the body to release all of those hormones that it's just fired off. And then he says it's best to come back and decide whether you're going to table this for another day, this discussion, or if you're going to continue the discussion. Now, the reason why it's important to come back is because many of us suffer from abandonment issues. And if somebody walks out in the middle of an argument, it creates some really strong feelings of abandonment. And so it's best to come back after that 20 minutes so the other person knows they're not abandoned. And we either say, okay, we're going to table this discussion for another day because remember, it's not resolvable.
Yeah.
Or we're going to continue the discussion. So that's how you handle stonewalling.
Wow. No, that's powerful, because I read a study somewhere that men's number one fear is rejection. And I was like, oh man, maybe that, and I guess that would go back to abandonment and feeling kind of like left high and dry. And I have seen that, in relationships we do. I mean, we start seeing things so narrowly. And so this has been really interesting, just looking at those 4 patterns. If you're getting in the mode of criticism, or you find yourself being defensive, just having some tools to diffuse those could be invaluable for everyone on here. And so you have a practice in Atlanta, but you can consult with people all over. I mean, beautiful thing about technology is you're right there in Atlanta, and we're here in Salt Lake City. Well, Cade's in St. George. We're in 3 different places. So how can people get in touch with you, Mishele, and do some work with you?
Oh, I appreciate you asking that. So the email address for my practice is overcominglifecouseling@gmail.com. So that's overcominglifecouseling, all one word, @gmail.com. And my practice it's best to contact me through email. It's just a little easier. But yeah, and we can set up video appointments easily. It is the technology age, and people do practice from anywhere, which is kind of the beauty of it.
Yeah, love it. Well, really appreciate you being on today. I mean, you've given me a lot to think about. I've got a date with my wife tonight, so I'm going to try those 3 questions. What does this coach me on this, and everybody? So I'm going to say, what's your meaning behind this? What is some history around this? And what's the 3rd question?
What are all your feelings?
What are all your feelings? Okay. Yep. What are all your feelings? And I love
then the
that.
last one is you just ask at the end, after both people have answered that question, you ask, is there a small compromise yet?
Okay. Beautiful. Love it. Well, thanks so much, Mishele. And I think everyone today, both on the Instagram world and on our webinar, really, I can't think of a single person who couldn't have gotten something out of that. So really appreciate being on, and looking forward to seeing you out here in Utah in the near future. And Cade, any final words from you?
No, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Good change of pace. I think, we talk so much about the physiology and kind of the science behind health, but this is like a healthy relationship. This can be applied to whether it's a spouse or a marriage. It could be friendships. It could be, work colleagues, team members, everything. So I think this is really cool. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
You're welcome.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be back same time, same place next week. Everybody have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.